Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. Although rather protective of their IPs, Disney are no stranger to stealing other people's ideas. Nowhere is this more clear than in 2002's tie-in game for Lilo and Stitch, basically being nothing more than a straight rip-off of Naughty Dog's Crash Bandicoot. The game was developed by Blitz Games Studio, who were founded in 1990 but sadly closed down in 2013. Unfortunately, they never really got to do anything other than create licensed tie-in games, so they never really got to have a successful breakout and become something more than what they were. Releasing on both PC and PlayStation 1, Lilo and Stitch was met with middle-of-the-road reviews from critics, which is a shame considering the source material, at least at the time, was one of the most beloved franchises. Hell, I think everyone still agrees Stitch is a cute little bastard.
Aw, she's so fucking cute! Oh shit, she's packing heat!
What makes this release a little bit confusing is the fact there are two different names, along with the fact there is a Game Boy Advance tie-in game that's completely separate from what we're going to be talking about today. Known as Disney's Lilo and Stitch in the American release and Disney's Lilo and Stitch Trouble in Paradise for the PAL release, it is easy to get them mixed up considering the Game Boy Advance game is known as Disney's Lilo and Stitch. Don't worry, I got confused by this as well. The plot follows that of the movie, so I'm not really going to talk about it at all during this video. We'll only be covering the PlayStation version today for the sake of simplicity, as I don't know much about the Game Boy Advance game outside of the fact it's an action platformer. I also couldn't really find sales numbers for the PS1 game, sadly. However, if I was to guess, I think it would have done somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million copies. There's nothing to suggest that that is true, but just given how big Lilo and Stitch was at the time, I think it would have outdone something like Treasure Planet. And unlike my Spartan Total Warrior video, subtle plug, where I tried to convince you that it isn't just a God of War clone, I'm actually not going to hide the fact here that Lilo and Stitch is a straight ripoff. Also, shout out to the guy who mentioned that the Spartan Total War game actually reminded them of Dynasty Warriors. I never made that connection growing up, and yeah, that was really cool. I appreciate that comment. But getting things back on track, it's not to say that stealing the gameplay of Crash Bandicoot was a bad idea, and this is because they did a really good job. And like they did for the Treasure Planet game for PS2, they clearly took inspiration from another game and did it justice. And if there was an IP that Disney owns to rip off Crash Bandicoot, I think Lilo and Stitch is perfect with the tropical themes. Because what else are you going to do with a Lilo and Stitch game in the early 2000s? Since Lilo and Stitch Trouble in Paradise clearly wears its inspiration like a badge of honor, what does the game do in order to stand out and not just be a straight clone of Crash? Well, it's kind of the little things. Firstly, having access to two characters to play as you would expect given the IP. Both characters will pretty much feel the same, but they do have some gameplay differences. You'll notice that Lilo has access to the voodoo spoons, which grant her an instant kill by dropping the ice cream guy on an enemy straight away, while also having the ability to pick up and place explosive jars. Although this system works, it can be a little bit finicky, sometimes leading you to take damage. More on that in a second. Whereas Stitch gets the ability to have a ranged attack where he can spit acid. It's not the biggest amount of range you'll ever get, but it is nice. Also, you'll notice you'll be able to fill up his bad meter in the bottom left corner, which is done by collecting coffee cups in the levels in order to have the ability to roll into enemies like Sonic. Personally, I never use this mechanic since I find the game to be more about the patience and timing rather than brute forcing your way through a level. Secondly, we have a health system allowing us to take up to 3 hits, which is really nice compared to Crash's one-hit death mechanic. This is nice, especially considering the game is aimed at the younger audiences. And finally, I'd have to say the game's boss battles, if you even really want to call them that. These are where a rock golem will basically be blocking a path, forcing you to fight it. These fights consist of basically baiting them out to take a few steps forward and then attacking their back when they're turned around. Rinse and repeat until they're dead. They never really evolve from this, and if you know what you're doing, you'll basically be able to win these fights without even thinking. I can understand why they've done this, since you have to remember this game is aimed at kids under the age of 10. However, this is where the game actually trips over its own feet, and that's because the game's difficulty is not super well balanced. It's not to say that the game is impossible or anything like that. As mentioned, those boss fights are pretty brain dead, but the actual levels themselves and the enemies within them can be a lot more difficult than you'd like due to the game's slightly finicky controls. They don't feel so bad that it's unplayable, but they definitely make the game more challenging than it needs to be. Certain jumps and movements require more precision than I think the game can actually allow you to have, and it feels like just a bit of luck if you can pull something off. And sure, it's probably a skill issue to an extent, don't get me wrong, but in all my research for the video, the consensus seems to be that the controls seem to be what screw you over and lead to a lot of unnecessary deaths, which is definitely a source of frustration when it comes to playing this game. The game's levels themselves, in their design, can lead to a bit of this frustration as well. The levels themselves don't really have any innovation going on, which is a bit of a shame, but it's understandable given the fact that it is a late PS1 release. It's probably why the game didn't go over super well amongst critics at the time. time. It is also important to note that the levels follow the formula of Crash Bandicoot. We have the traditional running forward, running towards the screen, and even the occasional side-scrolling level. The levels themselves aren't anything too crazy. They do have some nice little nooks and crannies for hidden things, and I would say the only real issue that I have with their design overall is the fact some of the platforms you need to jump onto are just a little bit too small.
That's what she said!
Meaning we need to have precision that the controls just don't allow for. Now I think it's important for me to note that I'm playing this game in an emulator, and the reason why I bring that up is because I want to talk about the game's visuals. Personally, I find this game very visually appealing, but I could understand if you played this on original hardware that it might not be so. This is due to the fact the PS1 is known to make textures be a little bit wobbly and warped. Now to me, the textures in this game look incredible. I understand, yes, it is a late PS1 game, so it should be able to make the most of the hardware by this point, but I much prefer this to the Treasure Planet PS1 game. And it goes a long way in making a tie-in game go from being just a cheap cash grab to being something a little bit more premium. This isn't to say the game is somehow visually flawless, and I do have some issues when it comes to the game's HUD elements such as your lives or items you're carrying looking a little bit cheap, but I don't think there's anything you could really complain about, at least when playing it through an emulator. And yes, I know using an emulator is cheating considering we can up-res a game to over 4K, however I think it is something worth doing because it can breathe new life into a lot of these older games and make them more visually appealing for a more modern audience. Because whether we like it or not, a lot of people like games to look their best. And even though there is a charm to the PS1, not everyone wants to deal with those warped textures. Plus, I'm just too lazy to set up the capture card for the old consoles. Up to this point, Lilo and Stitch has ripped off pretty much everything it could from Crash with the exception of the soundtrack. And the OST for Lilo and Stitch can be compared to that of Crash's, but I definitely think it has its own identity. Although not a musical, music itself plays a big part in the movie, and I think the composer John Scott, whose name I probably butchered so I do apologize, did an incredible job at making the music stand out. And I think it fits perfectly as you make your way through the game. There is nothing here that is offensive or out of place. The overall sound design itself is really good. The voice acting is solid, even if it is somewhat limited. The ambience is pretty good. It's about as good as you can get for a PS1 game. There is nothing here that I can complain about. The final thing I want to talk about is the game's collectibles. I've mentioned this in the Treasure Planet video, subtle plug yet again because damn I'm good, but being able to see a lot of the scenes from the movie on our home consoles at the time was absolutely mind-blowing. It's something we definitely take for granted these days with access to the internet and YouTube. Hell, I can look up pretty much all the important scenes on YouTube within a few seconds. But having those scenes in a game and having to play through the game to be able to see them gave me a reason to play it when I was a kid. It's definitely something that I think we take for granted these days. So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, it brings us to the end of another video. I hope you enjoyed this look back at the Lilo and Stitch game on PS1. If you want to support the channel, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. Also, if you want to go that extra mile, you can support me on Ko-fi for just $1 a month. Stay safe out there. Bye.